Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Poli-Sci 110, American Government and Politics. This lecture will answer the question, what does the bureaucracy do and how does it do it? So there are a lot of bad ideas surrounding bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is somewhat of a pejorative word or negative or a word with negative connotations. A lot of people, whenever they think of bureaucracy, they often think of inefficiency, bloatedness, impersonal, self-serving bureaucrats, and they think of needlessly complex offices that really don't accomplish a whole lot, hence it's inefficient. In other words, bureaucracies spend taxpayer money, but they don't really deliver a whole lot. This might be true in some ways, but in other ways, bureaucracies are very important and vital to the smooth operation of our country every single day. How is that? So it turns out that bureaucracy, and in particular various federal agencies, solve collective action problems. These are those problems that I mentioned earlier during the course, in which people, if they don't cooperate, there is a bad outcome. So a collective action problem occurs whenever people don't have the incentives to cooperate with each other, even though doing so will help everyone or make everyone better off. So how does bureaucracy solve collective action problems? Recall that people have incentives not to pay for goods that everyone can pay for. In other words, some people want to get out of taxes or paying taxes, for example. This is called a free rider problem. And what bureaucratic agencies do is that they provide these public goods instead. So we're talking about scientific knowledge or national parks or national security. Many people don't realize that things like the Department of Defense can be considered bureaucracy, for example, or the National Park Service also being a bureaucratic agency. And these are all public goods that these agencies provide, that is scientific knowledge or national parks and national security. Scientific knowledge, of course, being provided by various agencies within the federal government, such as the National Science Foundation. And so these bureaucratic agencies are on the front lines of providing these services. They often are the agencies that people interact with every single day, or that people choose to work for as employees. But bureaucracies also solve other issues as well. They solve coordination problems. These types of problems occur whenever people need to coordinate with each other, or else there will be an immediate bad outcome. So a collective action problem involves an outcome that may come true later on. So for example, with collective action, many different countries may choose to reduce their carbon dioxide emissions or not, but nevertheless, they have to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions, or else there could be catastrophic global climate ramifications later on down the road. With coordination problems, there needs to be coordination, or else there will be a more immediate negative effect. As an example, bureaucratic agencies like the Federal Aviation Administration regulate air traffic. The Federal Communications Commission regulate radio and television channel rights. Without these agencies, it would be difficult for airlines to know which runways to use and when not to use them. It would be difficult for radios to select which frequencies to broadcast over without interfering with other radio stations as well that might already broadcast on those frequencies. And so these agencies are really trying to help solve these coordination problems that can emerge between different companies or individuals. And yes, air traffic controllers are technically government employees as well. But bureaucratic agencies also help to solve prisoners' dilemmas within society. A prisoner's dilemma occurs whenever two entities in competition with each other tend to engage in a negative or in a behavior that brings both of them down. That is, they are both made worse off because they're assuming the other person is doing the worst possible thing. So for example, at the bottom of this slide, to gain market share, companies may have incentives to use false advertising And if you are a competing company and your competitor is using false advertising to gain more market share and take away from your business, then naturally you encounter an incentive to also use false advertising. This is a prisoner's dilemma. Bureaucratic agencies help to prevent that sort of situation from happening by enforcing rules regarding advertisements. So what is bureaucracy and how does it accomplish these really big goals? Bureaucracy really is a broad word. It includes executive branch departments, agencies, boards, and commissions that carry out responsibilities of the federal government. Many of them, but not all, answer to cabinet secretaries. That is, people who are appointed to the cabinet by the President of the United States and confirmed by the Senate. These bureaucratic agencies also issue various regulations in a book called the Federal Register. That book, those regulations are published before they are in effect. There's then a comment and notice period for businesses to provide feedback on those proposed rules, and then the agency will choose whether to change the rule or not before actually implementing it. And proposed regulations have to be approved by the president's staff, who work in the Office of Management and Budget not far from the White House. So to give you an example, bureaucratic agencies often have to interpret and implement laws made by Congress. And in order to do that, they have to create these different rules in order to establish guidelines for what those laws will look like on the ground. So as an example, here we have an excerpt from a border security law from about 15 years ago. And it simply reads that no later than 18 months after the enactment of this act, the Secretary of Homeland Security shall take all actions the Secretary determines necessary and appropriate to achieve and maintain operational control over the entire international land and maritime borders of the United States. That is a very big mandate given to the Secretary of Homeland Security from Congress. It may not be clear how the Secretary and the Department of Homeland Security should implement that law. They have to make some decisions. However, Congress has expressed some legislative intent. Later on in that law, further down, there's some fine print that also specifies that there will be reinforcing fencing, for example, 2 layers of which, with additional physical barriers, roads, lighting, cameras, and sensors. And further down, it also says if the topography of a specific area has an elevation grade that exceeds 10%, the Secretary may use other means to secure the area, such as surveillance or barrier tools. So Congress has been very specific in terms of what the Secretary may or may not do. But often Congress does not write very detailed laws, and it leaves a lot more discretion up to bureaucratic agencies. Bureaucratic agencies also have to make those rules and regulations that we mentioned earlier. To give you examples, bureaucratic agencies have to determine exactly how much pollution is too much pollution before federal law is violated. Or they also have, different agencies have to determine what airplane boarding safety procedures look like. These are not rules determined by members of Congress directly or included in the laws, but instead, these are decisions or procedures that bureaucratic agencies have to implement or determine and then implement. If we look at regulations over time, we found that the number of federal regulations that are implemented by federal bureaucratic agencies have increased precipitously. This is often a point of political contention, with many political conservatives saying that there is too much regulation on private business as well. But at the same time, political liberals may say that many of these regulations are intended to solve coordination problems or to provide other public goods and services. And we also notice that towards the final year of every presidential administration, bureaucratic agencies tend to implement more rules in that final year. They do this as a way to have influence over the bureaucracy, the White House to have influence over the bureaucracy, even though a new president will soon be taking office. Here we have a chart of major final rules published by presidential year, and we see that in the final year, 92, 2000, 2008, for example, or 2016, there tend to be more rules published in those particular years. And finally, because many of these rules may involve disputes, bureaucracies have methods for adjudication. If a business, for example, objects to how a rule is implemented and says that you do not have a mandate for that in federal law, then bureaucratic agencies often have some sort of way to identify, to address those disputes or to identify violations of the laws as well.